Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. We are glad you're here for today's webinar, Public Service and Pop Culture, Learning About Government and Nonprofit from Your Favorite Shows. I'm Greg Barry, Director of Communications in the Office of Alumni Affairs. Before we get to introducing today's guests, let's start out with a quick question. What's your favorite way to learn about public service outside of formal education? Your options are listening to podcasts, watching TV or movies, reading books or articles, following social media accounts, or talking with friends and colleagues. Please select the best answer for you. We're going to leave that poll up for a bit so we can make sure you make your selection. We're going to go ahead and drop the results in the chat when we close the poll. As a disclaimer, as with any virtual event, occasionally technical issues may occur. If you experience any video or audio issues, simply click reconnect or refresh your screen to return to the presentation quickly. A quick note for today's live attendees, the webinar is being recorded. Once the replay is available on our website, we'll send you an email with the link so you can watch it at any time. And I'm going to skip past those poll results. As I mentioned, I'm going to go ahead and drop those in the chat, so be on the lookout for that. At this time, I would like to welcome Jordan Giddens, a member of the MPA Alumni Board and current representative on the UAB Young Alumni Council, to introduce today's guests. Welcome, Jordan.
Welcome. Thanks so much, Greg. Good afternoon. I'm Jordan Giddens, Vice President of the UAB MPA Alumni Board and member of the National Alumni Society's Young Alumni Council. On behalf of the UAB National Alumni Society, the College of Arts and Sciences, and the Department of Political Science and Public Administration, welcome to Public Service and Pop Culture. Learn about government and nonprofit from your favorite shows. From Schitt's Creek and Parks and Recreation to podcasts and even sports, pop culture gives us accessible on-ramps to understand how public service really works. We're joined today by two outstanding UAB scholars, both of whom have been recognized with the College of Arts and Sciences Dean's Award for Excellence in Teaching, and recently co-published a book on this very topic entitled Teaching Public Administration with Pop Culture. First, Dr. Erin Borry, Professor and Graduate Program Director in the Department of Political Science and Public Administration. Her research spans red tape and rule bending, social equity, and public administration and pop culture. Joining Dr. Borry today is Dr. Pete Jones, Associate Professor in the same department, whose work focuses on how governments manage resources, especially budgeting, financial management, and education finance. Thank you all for being here today and all you do to support UAB. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Erin Borry and Dr. Pete Jones.
Thank you, Jordan. We're going to start out by sharing a little bit about how we got to thinking about pop culture and portrayals of public service in it. So Jordan already mentioned our research interest, but we share our research interest through pedagogy. So we are interested in how to best teach our students about public administration and public service, and ways to engage our students so that they'll remember these things, long past the completion of their degree. And as professors of public administration, this is a field that focuses on public service, which can also happen in nonprofit organizations. It can happen in government organizations, but public service can also happen in private business as well, depending on the work that they do. And so no matter what kind of pop culture you consume, you probably can find some public service in there. So some history before we get into our examples. In 2015, about 10 years ago, I received a grant from the college to content analyze the series Parks and Recreation to see if it was a useful teaching tool. One of the unique attributes of Parks and Recreation is that it focuses on non-political actors in a government agency. And so it focuses on the bureaucrats. And when it first came out in 2009, I was a grad student. I was too focused on getting my PhD work completed, so I wasn't able to watch the whole series. And the grant allowed me to watch the series, code it, and I ended up finding that about half of the series had some really useful examples of public service in in a primary way, so like showing the entire episode to some of my students, or even with secondary themes throughout some of these episodes. And Pete then was around the same time exploring how to use classroom simulations.
Thanks, Erin. I'm going to talk a little bit about my simulations. And one of my early classes on public budgeting and financial management, I assigned a capital improvement plan project. And this was something that I adopted from one of the professors I had in grad school. And one of the tweaks that I made was just allowing the students to pick the name of their city and really get creative with their city name, the projects, all of the things about the city. And as the students began to get more creative with their projects, I noticed that they weren't just enjoying the project more, but learning more deeply from it. So you can see on the left, one of the teams had a Beyonce-inspired town where all of the capital projects were named after Beyonce songs, and they surveyed town residents about their priorities with that well-designed postcard. I also did a classroom simulation, and this was inspired by a grant that UAB funded to develop some classroom simulations. And so these were done in class and included scenarios like a team presenting for a nonprofit grant. So they had to present a grant proposal to a funder. Another simulation I did was put students in teams where each team represented an executive department within a city, and they had to submit their budget request to the mayor. And so you can see on the right some of the initiatives that the fire chief of Blazingham, again, the students got to name the town. And they essentially put in those initiatives and then asked the mayor for increases in the budgets. And these simulations really helped bring public finance concepts to life, and they gave students a chance to practice what we were learning. And that's where really parks came in. So first, let me say one of the great things about teaching in this program is that I get to work with world-class educators doing really innovative things. And I'd already been using Erin's Parks and Rec examples in my budgeting class because, believe it or not, the town of Pawnee had several examples of bad financial decisions. But instead of using those episodes as a standalone assignment, I had the idea to combine the two, mainly to address one of the big deficiencies that was popping up in the simulations that I'd drawn up. And that was that the character traits that I'd written up really weren't resonating with students. And even if I could write better ones, which I definitely could not, it was going to be much easier for students to act like a TV show character they were familiar with than try to base what they were doing on a bunch of background information I wrote up. So Dr. Borry and I received a grant that would allow us to develop simulations based on Parks and Rec and its characters. And we created 4 unique simulations for different classes, including my budgeting class and her open government class. Those simulations allowed students to take the role of a character from the show and act out a realistic scenario. So for example, one of the simulations in her open government class is a public meeting, and another focuses on a decision related to contracting out park services. And I have them work through a budget crisis that's actually based on the end of season 2 and beginning of season 3 in the show. So in the meantime, we were both finding ways to incorporate other forms of pop culture in our classes. I think it's no surprise that after watching the show multiple times, Erin had become a bit burned out by parks. And so she started assigning podcasts and other shows. And I'd found ways to incorporate music and sports into the classes I was teaching. And so as we found that students were really enjoying these things, we were also finding that they remembered the lessons better and longer. And alumni who have since graduated will bring up these shows that they watched or podcasts that they listened from our classes. They also, by extension, were better able to remember the lessons that we assigned through pop culture. And really, it led to better classroom discussions. It led to better outcomes and all of the things that they were doing in classes. And so what came of all of this were discussions between me and Erin about how pop culture was this great vehicle for people to think about public service. And that was really where our book was born a couple years ago. And I'm going to pass it back to Erin now to kind of talk through some of the pop culture that we cover in the book and the ways that we've used it.
Yeah, so and importantly, some of the examples from Parks and Rec and from any of the examples we talk about today sometimes the public service is portrayed in a negative way. And so often some of the lessons come from what could have gone differently or what could have been better decisions that could have been made. And so we're going to share with you some examples from television today. We're not going to talk about parks in particular, but we're happy to answer questions about that. But I'm going to share an example from a documentary series, and then Pete will talk about an example from a different sitcom. One of my favorite sort of lessons that I use in my classes or forms of example of pop culture used in my classes, How to Fix the Drug Scandal, which is a documentary that was released on Netflix about 5 years ago. And it covers two different crimes that occurred in Massachusetts by drug lab chemists. Now, drug labs or state crime labs have chemists who will test drugs that are seized in an arrest. And if those substances do not test positive as being an illegal substance, there's no case. So these chemists are incredibly important to the criminal justice system because they help determine whether a crime has actually occurred in the first place. And this docuseries, which is 4 episodes, covers the wrongdoings by 2 different drug chemists in 2 different drug labs in the state. So the woman on the left side of the picture is Sonia Farrick, and she was a drug chemist in the Amherst, Massachusetts lab. And it was discovered that over a period of several years, she was actually using the drugs that were in the lab, whether they were the drugs that were seized or the standards that those seized substances were compared against. And in Boston, Annie Ducan, the woman on the right of the picture, she was found to be dry labbing. And dry labbing is when you say you perform a test on the substances, but you actually don't. And she would say yes or no, these are the substance that we assume they are, without actually performing the test. And this enabled her to perform quickly because she wasn't actually taking the time to test all of them. So she was able to produce much more tests than her coworkers. And in both cases, these were happening separately at separate crime labs at roughly the same time, and they were discovered around the same time. Lab culture played a role in both of these. So in the case of the Amherst lab with Sonia Farrick, there was not a lot of oversight. They were underfunded, overworked, and they weren't doing the checks and balances that should have been done when it comes to the inventory of the substances or checking test results. And in Boston, you had a culture of sort of, Annie Ducan is supposed to be a neutral public servant. Her job was to just test these drugs or test these substances, but she was kind of becoming friendly with some of the prosecutors. So she saw herself on the side of the state, which made her not neutral anymore. So she more likely was saying that drugs or that substances were drugs when perhaps they weren't. And at the same time that was happening, because she was so quote unquote productive, because she was able to do this at higher rates than her colleagues, nobody really thought about it because she was performing so well. They were able to get drug tests completed quickly and then move on to handling their cases. But in the criminal justice system, due process is really important. And so the accuracy of the test should be more important than the speed. And, docuseries are fascinating because they live in the space with which they are presented to us. The documentaries, docuseries are podcasts about real life events, but they don't stop there. So what's great about public service examples in sort of nonfiction versions of pop culture is that the story continues. So these are some headlines from the last several years since the documentary has aired, and it's been over 10 years since these crimes had happened. But there are more lessons to be learned. So the state has made efforts to improve the the conditions of crime labs, but there are still some issues. All of the criminal defendants that were part of cases touched by these two were able to question whether their convictions should stand. So they were able to settle with the state for $14 million, but they were not able to receive their seized property back. And then there were some people in this case that furthered that wrongdoing. So you had some prosecutors who were hiding the extent of Sonia Farrick's drug use. And one prosecutor was disbarred, and some people that she was working with were also punished. And so overall, from this documentary series, we can learn about what it's like for government agencies to respond to a crisis, and also to think about ethics, not just personal ethics and accountability, but the accountability held by, or the responsibility of, agencies and organizations to also be held accountable. Systems accountability is really important too. Like, how did the system fail? How did the system allow for this to happen? And I think, a play on the title, I'm sure this was purposeful, but this is not how you handle or fix a drug scandal. And there are many more details than I can share here, but I highly recommend watching it. And then Pete's television example is a little bit lighter than a drug scandal, so he will share his example with a beloved sitcom.
Yeah, this might say something about the pop culture I consume compared to Erin here, but I mentioned the capital improvement plan earlier, and as much as I loved how creative students got with their towns, again, one of the things that was missing was that teamwork element, and I really couldn't develop kind of the tensions often involved in developing a capital improvement plan. So I decided to shift the scenario and base it on a TV show called Schitt's Creek. For those of you unfamiliar with the program, it's a comedy series about a wealthy family who lose everything because they never paid their taxes. Another nod to my public budgeting class. And they're forced to live in a small town that they once bought as a joke. And during the series, one of the characters, Moira, runs for the town council. And so I was able to really base the capital improvement project on this Schitt's Creek, town, and allow the students to take on roles of these well-known characters. And those characters have distinct personalities and motivations. They interact with each other in specific ways. And not only does that enhance the teamwork aspect, but now the students could actually see the capital improvements needed in the town. They could visualize the town. And while they still had to use the kind of financial tools that we're learning in class, like forecasting or bond financing, they got to do it as this fun, over-the-top character. And so in doing this, my hope was that the setup made that project a little less daunting. It allowed students to kind of wrap their arms around the project in a fun way and then engage with those kind of more difficult topics in a way that just made them feel more comfortable. Another way that we did it, so of course, maybe our go-to are TV shows and documentaries, but we use a variety of pop culture vehicles, including movies, podcasts, books, music, sports, and media. And we want to share a few additional examples just because, and I looked at the poll, it seems like not a lot of folks really think about public service when they're engaging with these type of things. So hopefully the examples that we share give you an idea that you in fact can think about public service when you're listening to your favorite podcast or watching your favorite sports team. So I'm going to pass it back to Erin for this first one.
Yeah, so one of my favorite things to do is listen to podcasts, and my favorite podcasts change over time and what I'm listening to currently. But one of my all-time favorite podcasts, it's one of the most well-produced that I've listened to, is called Criminal. And the premise of Criminal podcasts is that every story, roughly 30 minutes every other Friday, but every story has a criminal element, but it need not be, violent crime. It can be tangential to the story. It can be a small crime. And I think these two examples that I'll tell you about illustrate that well. So in the first example, No Place Like Home, the podcast episode starts out with a man named Neil White talking about how he received an 18-month federal prison sentence for kiting checks in the early 1990s. And kiting checks was writing checks from bank accounts that did not have money to cover insufficient funds in other bank accounts. And at the time, it would take several days for checks to clear. And so the banks wouldn't even know that there was no money to cover it. And so he was doing this to the tune of hundreds of thousands of dollars over a period of time. So he was sentenced to prison in Louisiana at a place called Carville. And it was a minimum security prison for mostly white collar criminals. And when he got there, he learned that it was also a place where patients of leprosy, or it's also known as Hansen's disease, were residing. Now, leprosy is a bacterial infection that is not as highly contagious as was once thought, but in the mid-20th century, leprosy patients were often brought together to live amongst each other, so that way the disease wouldn't spread. Over time, a lot of these patients, especially in Carville, just stayed there because that's what they knew life to be like. So now these patients, such as Mr. Pete, who is on the bike in that photo, they are getting older. They may not want to go live in a retirement home, so they've stayed there. And the podcast goes through the relationships that Neil had with these patients and with how the patients interacted with the inmates. But what's really interesting from a public service perspective is that you had intergovernmental conflicts or lack of coordination, so to speak. So you had this facility that was run by the health department, and then you have the Bureau of Prisons that see this large facility becoming less and less relevant because the patients are leaving or they're passing away. And so the Bureau of Prisons sees an opportunity to take this facility over. The health department did not want that to happen. So what they did was they got Carville on the National Registry of Historic Places, and the Bureau of Prisons had to abandon the idea because being on the registry would not allow them to make modifications. In the second example, he's still neutral. We hear from a man named Dan Stevenson, who is a resident of Oakland. Across from his house, there's a small plot of land in the middle of the street, and people kept dumping trash on it, and it would drive him crazy. And he was talking about how you could take the trash away, but as soon as one person puts another piece of trash, other people will put more trash there. Contacted the city wouldn't do anything. And eventually he decided that if he put a religious figure on there, people wouldn't leave trash where there's an element of, a religion or something like that. It would be too sacred. So he went with a Buddha because he felt like that was the more neutral of the religious figures. So he put a small Buddha there. I think he got it from Home Depot or something like that. And what happened is that the local Buddhist community created a shrine. It became bigger. So in the photo there, that's a more recent photo. I don't know which of the Buddhas in the photo is the original one, but I know that it was small. But the side effect was that crime went down in the neighborhood because of this religious figure, which then ended up becoming a shrine for the Buddhist community. And though Dan is not a public servant and his motives certainly were selfish at first, this had a community impact. This had a positive impact on the community through the reduction of crime. Another example is reality TV. So I really like reality TV. For a long time, it was one of the ways that I could engage in pop culture without any connection to my work, and that has become less the case over the years. But one example is Northwood's Law. There are other shows like this, Lone Star Law. I believe they're on Animal Planet or A&E or something like that. But they follow game wardens in the course of their work. So Northwood's Law follows the game wardens in Maine and New Hampshire. And you'll see them, through the course of their day where they respond to, a rescue mission where somebody's on a mountain and they get hurt and they need someone to come get them. Or there's a bear, a wild bear that's in a city or residential neighborhood, and they have to figure out how to get the bear out. You might see them check that people who are boating and fishing actually have their licenses. So you actually get to watch public servants in the course of their jobs. And one of my favorite escapes was through the Real Housewives series. And over the last several years, the escape has not really existed because we've seen a few housewives stars serve federal prison sentences. And in this picture, you have Erica Girardi and her soon-to-be former husband, Tom Girardi. And she is on the Real Housewives of Beverly Hills. And her husband is a plaintiff's attorney, or was a plaintiff's attorney. And these are the attorneys that help people in civil cases when they believe that they have an opportunity or they deserve to have a financial settlement of some sort. And those types of attorneys can get settlements upwards of millions of dollars. So what this lawyer was doing was he was winning these settlements for his clients, but he was not giving them the funds that they deserved. And he was using that money to fund his own lifestyle. He was recently convicted and started his 7-year prison term earlier this year. But I have brought this up in my classes to talk about regulation, right? So professions such as lawyers, medical doctors, teachers, like they're regulated by state boards. And the Bar Association in every state is the regulator of attorneys in that state. And what had happened was that we learned later was that there were hundreds of complaints starting in the 1980s against Tom Girardi and his law firm about settlement funds. And they weren't really investigated because he was friends with them. He had them in their pocket, so to speak. And so it raises questions about, how do you regulate industries when you can kind of be too close to them? And so another example of this is the stories behind the Dr. Death podcast and TV series with medical doctors. It's how do you effectively regulate professions and ensure that they are doing the best for the public. And Pete has a couple more examples using some other pop culture.
Yeah, so I love sports and music. I try to incorporate those when I can. And for any of our alums here, you hopefully remember the John Oliver video on using public debt to finance sports stadiums that I'm showing on the left. For those of you unfamiliar, John Oliver really details kind of this new phenomenon over the last 10 or 20 years where sports franchises will threaten to leave a city unless the city builds them a new stadium. And so we're seeing new absolutely beautiful stadiums pop up quite a bit. So you see the Miami Marlins stadium there. Los Angeles just got one. Las Vegas is getting a new one. Mercedes-Benz, all of those different stadiums. But those are financed through public dollars, most often through municipal debt. And as I say municipal debt, a lot of times when I say that in class, I see students immediately fall asleep because it's a pretty dry topic. And so if I'm able to really engage those topics through a sports lens or through something that they're interested in, it really helps us, again, start the conversation to motivate why some of this matters. And then I listen to music all the time. And so I've just started incorporating some smaller assignments where I've asked students to put together playlists of songs that remind them of class. And so in my quantitative methods class, I often get Counting Stars by One Republic with this idea of, count measures or how to quantify or operationalize different phenomena. And then Taxman by the Beatles is a staple in my public budgeting class, as people often think about that as we're talking about taxes. I'm going to pass it over real quick to some lessons learned, and then I'll close it down with how we spot public service.
Yeah, and so if you think about, the array of pop culture that we have, we can think about public service appearing in several ways. You have pop culture where it is about public service. So Parks and Recreation as a show inherently is about public administration because that's what a Parks and Recreation department does. Other examples might be Madam Secretary, focusing on the high-level federal government work. The game warden show, Northwoods Law, Lone Star Law, Cops, is also about public service and the work that they do. Pop culture can also feature themes of public service. So those podcasts that I mentioned, criminal podcasts, they're not directly about public service at all, but there are links in there to public service. You might also find novels that you read to feature elements of public service as well. And then pop culture can also show us experiences with public service. So in Parks and Recreation, you have many examples of members of the public coming to the department or coming to a member of that department, and it shows their experience with bureaucrats. And you may have seen the movie Zootopia, where Judy Hopps, the main character Bunny, goes to the DMV to look up a license plate, and the DMV is staffed by sloths. And that's a representation, of course, of government being slow. You might also learn about public service by making connections to the workplace, no matter what kind of workplace you're watching, whether it's a business, a government, a nonprofit, and no matter what kind of workplace you work in. But a lot of pop culture features good and bad leadership, and so sometimes we can draw parallels to our own work. And then pop culture is also a type of artifact of public service. So you can look at older pop culture and see how public service is portrayed, is perceived, is like commented on in that. So you can think about All the President's Men, a movie that came out in the 70s about the Nixon Watergate scandal and how that portrays, public servants at the time. And you have artifacts, but then also those artifacts keep going. So we have new things coming out. We have new ways of exploring public service and pop culture. So right now we have Abbott Elementary that focuses on schools, as they are also instruments of public service. And then next month, there's a new show called DMV. We don't know exactly what that'll look like, but I'm sure that we will see themes of public service in that series as well.
So one of the questions we get asked a lot is, we'll bring up an example and people just think, how did you find that? Or how did you think of that? And the main thing that we tell people is you're already getting messages about public service with every type of media you consume. I think just being aware of that, you can really start to think more critically about it. And so Erin just brought up, how we see it in TV, and we've seen, paramedics over time with the show Emergency from the 1970s, as a show we mentioned in the book, even now to shows like 911 Rescue or whatever that looks like. We see themes over time emerge, but really just engaging with what you're currently listening to, watching, thinking about. And so a great example of this is Taylor Swift, which I feel obligated to bring up. First, we have Taylor's versions of albums, that have come out over the last several years because of copyright laws. Something public service manage with the federal government, something we think about kind of from a public service aspect and ways in which we need the federal government. And then the Eras Tour motivated Swifties to go after Ticketmaster's monopoly on the ticket industry. So much so that there's a Department of Justice lawsuit against Live Nation and Ticketmaster right now. And so if you're a Swiftie, if you're not a Swiftie, all of these things that are happening really within pop culture have a public service element to them that once you spot it, start to think, how can I learn from this? What does this perspective tell me? Does it represent good or bad public service? Those paramedic shows that I just talked about always have a really attractive male lead. And so what does that tell us about our portrayal of public service over time? Really starting to dig into those things is where we start. And we think that that's just the easiest way for really anybody else. And so we want to close with that, just to encourage you to think about the pop culture you're consuming. Think about the elements of public service in it. And then hopefully you start to identify them, start to think more deeply of it, and start to enjoy it as maybe not as much as Erin and I do, but enjoy it more than you have. So with that, we'll open it up to any questions.
Fantastic. If you do have a question, go ahead and drop it in the chat. I'm going to go ahead and get rid of the slides right there. So I did jot down, a couple. You brought up Northwood's Law, guilty pleasure. Every once in a while, I watch that. My go-to-bed show is Seized at the Airport often, or Seized at the Border. So I'm watching. I didn't even realize it at the time. So what's the biggest misconception that some of these shows, especially the real-life ones, have about public service? What do they get the most flack about?
That's a good question. I think sometimes these shows help us realize that these people are people too, that they also have feelings. So I have not, to be honest, I've only watched Northwood's Law. I know the Seized. My parents watch them like during the day when there's nothing else on. But I talked in our book about one particular episode of Northwood's Law. And one of my favorite, that each episode generally follows like three or four storylines. And one of my favorites was they received a call about people using a boat slip as a swimming ramp. And that's dangerous. So that's not allowed. The rules do not allow you to swim on boat slips. And so the officer went to tell people, this is not allowed, don't do it. But then they got another call later that day that said people were still swimming. And you see this interaction with this citizen who was like, show me where the rules are, like, show me where it says this. And so, she was a little bit in his face, and he handled it really well and was kind of like, listen, if you have a problem with this, like, you can come to talk, like, you can call and talk to, our department or whatever, but the rules say, you can't do this. But so I think in some ways it humanizes them. They show their frustration to the camera, maybe not necessarily to the person that they're interacting with. But I think that is really beneficial in some ways. In other ways, these shows can be sort of like propagandistic, like, very pro government in a way that maybe not be so healthy. I'm not sure, but I don't know. I'm sure there's been research on the impact of cops and, law enforcement perceptions, but I'm not familiar, but I know it's got to be out there.
And I have questions that kind of hit both of those last two comments you had. I'll start with, so I mentioned that for me, Seized at the Airport or Seized at the Border could be my fall asleep show. I watch it because I don't have to think. Mm-hmm. But a lot of people watch them critically. How critical should people be of TV shows and how public service is portrayed? Or should they just take it as entertainment? Or should it be up to the individual? How should they approach things?
Yeah, I think one of the things that TV shows sometimes get wrong is they portray, we want the entertainment value of it. And sometimes we miss really the vital aspects of what, airport security does or how they keep things safe. And so I think in many ways that context is missed in terms of just the vital public service delivery that folks in, the Northwoods or the, airports or whatever public service role is. Again, because we, for the entertainment value, want the kind of, interesting things. And if we thought, well, oh my gosh, if all of these things were always going through the airport or, it's just not the case. It's because you've got great public servants doing the great work to stop them. And then, people stop trying to bring those things in. So I think that's often missed. That we need to think critically of, one, there's a human element, but two, it's probably not as bad or they're doing a pretty good job compared to a lot of the ways that public service is portrayed.
But I also think, to piggyback off that is like, some of it may not be so great, and to answer your question another way, Greg, I can't watch shows like that for entertainment because I'm like, are they following the rules? Like, because they're doing enforcement stuff. So there's constitutional elements, and that's not fun for me. So I can't watch those shows for fun. But it is up to the person. If you want to take something out of it, go for it. But if you just want to watch it for entertainment, then it can be that too.
And a lot of times, I shouldn't say a lot of times, but sometimes the producers, because ratings drive things, producers can go a little far. There was a case with Live PD a few years ago before it was ultimately canceled after the 2020 George Floyd riots, where they destroyed or were accused of destroying some footage of a police brutality instance. So producers have to be good stewards as well, don't they? It's not just us consuming, but it's on the getting that out and disseminating that information as well.
And that's part of the critical thinking that has to happen, right? Like all of this happens through the lens of the people who produce or make it or whatever. And we did talk about this in our book a little bit. Who is making what you're seeing and how does their experience impact that? So some of it is the lens through which I'm watching. What does that tell me about the perception of public service that I'm receiving? And I mean, that's part of it, thinking critically just about the angles, not about the content so much, but how does that influence the content that I am seeing?
I'll jump in here and add too that it's an incredibly difficult thing to do, is really kind of to accurately portray, to make it interesting, to check a lot of those boxes. And so I'll do a quick plug for Michael Lewis's recent book on Who is Government, because I think he does a really good job of, telling, there's, interesting storytelling, there's highlighting, the ideals of public services, the challenges, the misgivings, all of those things in these kind of chapters that he writes or that the book goes through. And so I think to Erin's point, like you really have to think about who's writing and why, but acknowledging too, that it's just a very difficult thing to do to make some of this stuff engaging while fair.
So with the current climate and with what is going on, do you see more interaction between the citizenry and their local governments after seeing TV shows that portray government?
I don't know. I do get a sense that, some of my students have gotten really inspired by Parks and Recreation, the Leslie Notes of the world. And I think that motivates them to engage more. I don't know if that's, a statistically significant increase, but certainly I think that portrayals of government, especially that are not overtly political, can be motivating for people to choose public service as a job.
I would agree. I think I'm currently teaching a class on leadership in public service with some undergraduates at UAB, and just because they engage with pop culture and different types of pop culture in ways that I didn't do as an undergraduate, right? They're hearing about policy problems. They're hearing about ways to engage with the policy process by not, normally you would have to read the news or you'd have to kind of pay attention to the TV or whatever that looked like. But now because they were able to listen to a podcast or they see something on TikTok, their antennas are up in ways that I am really excited about, because I think they're going to think about how to engage with their local governments in particular, but maybe other areas of public service, and try to make the world better. And so, I would say that yes, they're definitely thinking more about ways to engage, just because that's something they saw on TikTok.
Any additional recs for podcasts related to this topic that you can share?
That's all Erin.
Sure. I think a lot of any criminal justice podcast has, links to government, because it's such a legal, regulated area. But, some of the ones that I talk about in classes or that I assign are from criminal. There's a sister podcast from criminal called This Is Love, and that's stories around themes of love. And there's one episode called Among the Oak Trees that I think portrays public service. I mentioned Dr. Death earlier. That one's a little bit darker, but that would be an example. send me an email. I have them, but not off the top of my head, because they can be a little bit on the heavier side. They're not necessarily the most positive outcomes, though.
This has been fantastic. This has been a very interesting topic. And, I truly appreciate you both being here today. I know, Dr. Jones, you are out of town even, and you slid away to be with us. So Dr. Borry, Dr. Jones, thanks so much for being here this afternoon.
Thank you for having us.
Glad to be here. Thanks, Greg.
You are so very welcome. And, I do want to mention to our live audience that this webinar was recorded. Once it's uploaded onto our website, you'll get an email with the link so you can revisit the session or share it with others. In the meantime, we'd love for you to join us for these upcoming webinars. Want to feel your best in your 20s? Join Dr. Erin Snyder on September 25th for practical tips on building healthy habits that last during thriving in your 20s, essential healthy habits for young adults. On October 7th, learn how to stand out in a virtual job market with expert advice in networking, interviewing, and more during remote control, navigating your career from anywhere. Why do nightmares happen, and how can we manage them? Join Dr. Christina Pierpola Parker on October 30th for a spooky dive into the science of nightmares, the dark side of dreams. And finally, confused about carbs? On November 19th, Tara Kelly breaks down the science behind this misunderstood nutrient and clears up common myths during the science of carbs, unraveling the spaghetti. Register for these and more at alumni.uab.edu/events. Now, as we wrap up, we'd love to hear from you. Your feedback helps us improve and shape future webinars. Just scan the QR code on your screen to access a brief survey and share your thoughts. Once again, thanks so much for joining us. And as always, go Blazers.